"Look at our live-in maid," my daughter-in-law said with a laugh. Good for something, at least. Everyone thought I couldn't hear her. The camera was pointed at my back as I stood at the dining room table arranging white porcelain plates that had belonged to my mother. I kept my hand steady. I placed another fork beside another napkin. I acted as though her words were nothing more than background noise. But in that moment, something inside me changed. I'm Margaret Wilson. I'm 69 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed that patience could solve almost anything. My late husband used to say that kindness always revealed a person's true character. Standing there beneath the warm glow of the chandelier, listening to my daughter-in-law turned me into a joke for her online followers. I finally realized he had been right. The dining room looked beautiful. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. A roast rested in the kitchen, filling the house with the smell of rosemary and garlic. Outside, sunlight streamed through the large windows overlooking the backyard. It should have felt like a family gathering. Instead, it felt like a performance. Amber loved recording everything. Every meal, every holiday, every conversation became content for social media. At first, I thought it was harmless. She said she enjoyed sharing family memories. She said she wanted to preserve special moments. But over time, I noticed something. The camera was never aimed at herself when she lost her temper. It was never recording when she ignored someone's feelings. Somehow, it always captured other people at their most vulnerable. "Mom, can you bring the serving bowls?" my son Jason called from the living room. I carried them in without complaint. I always did. For 3 years, I had lived in the lower level of their home after my husband passed away. Jason insisted it was the best arrangement. He said he worried about me living alone. He said families should stay together. At first, it felt comforting. I helped with dinner once or twice a week. Then it became every night. I watched my granddaughter Emily after school. Then I started driving her to activities. I folded laundry, organized closets, cleaned the kitchen. Little by little, the favors stopped feeling temporary. They became expectations. I never complained. I loved my family. I wanted to help. Yet somewhere along the way, my role quietly changed. I was no longer Margaret. I was simply useful. "Get the candles, Grandma," Amber called. The tall ones. Her voice carried the same tone people use when giving instructions to an employee. I retrieved the candles and placed them carefully on the table. Amber never said thank you. She rarely did. As I adjusted the centerpiece, I caught my reflection in the dark television screen across the room. Silver hair, blue eyes, a soft smile I had practiced for years whenever life disappointed me. Behind me, laughter erupted. Amber was still filming. "Seriously," she said. "She practically runs this place." More laughter followed. I looked down at the polished wood table. Every plate was perfectly aligned. Every napkin folded precisely. My husband used to admire details like that. He believed caring for people mattered. I wondered what he would think if he could see this now. Then I heard another voice. Quiet. Hesitant. "Mom, maybe don't post that." It was Emily, my 16-year-old granddaughter. The room grew silent for a second. Amber laughed again. "Relax. It's just a joke. Just a joke." Funny how the people causing pain always called it that. I continued setting the table. I never turned around. I never said a word. But what Amber didn't know was that someone else had heard everything. And before that week was over, a single video would reveal far more than she ever intended. That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen. The dishwasher hummed softly. The scent of roasted vegetables still lingered in the air. I stood at the sink and stared out the window above it, watching the porch light illuminate the empty backyard. Years ago, when my husband Daniel was still alive, evenings felt different. We would sit together with a cup of coffee and talk about simple things. The neighbors, the weather, Emily when she was little. Nothing important. Yet somehow those ordinary moments had made a house feel like a home. After Daniel passed away, the silence became unbearable. Jason worried about me. At least that was what he said. He had shown up at my front door one rainy afternoon, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a look of concern on his face. He told me he hated the idea of me living alone. He said families should take care of each other. A month later, I packed my belongings and moved into the lower level of his house. At first, everything seemed warm and welcoming. Amber greeted me with hugs. Emily helped unpack boxes. Jason insisted I keep my favorite armchair near the basement window because he knew how much I loved reading in natural light. For a while, I believed I had made the right decision. Then small things started changing. The first request seemed harmless. Amber asked if I could watch Emily for an hour after school because she had a meeting. I happily agreed. The next week it became 3 afternoons. Soon it became every weekday. Then there were the grocery runs, the cooking, the laundry, the household errands. Every favor arrived wrapped in gratitude at first. Then the gratitude slowly disappeared while the expectations remained. One morning I woke up with a sore back after spending an entire Saturday cleaning the garage with Jason. When I came upstairs for breakfast, Amber handed me a list of chores she had written on a yellow notepad. She smiled as though it were perfectly normal. I remember staring at that piece of paper while my coffee cooled in my hands. Vacuum the family room. Pick up dry cleaning. Prepare dinner before 6. Water the flower beds. I told myself she was overwhelmed. I told myself families help one another. It was easier to make excuses than face the truth. Over time, my own routines vanished. I stopped attending my Wednesday book club because somebody always needed a ride somewhere. I missed lunches with old friends because there was always another task waiting at home. Without realizing it, my world became smaller and smaller until nearly every hour revolved around someone else's schedule. The strange part was that Jason barely noticed. He left early for work and returned late. When he came home, dinner was on the table, the house was clean, and everything appeared effortless. He never saw the hours behind it. He never saw me folding towels after midnight or organizing cabinets while everyone else relaxed. I do not think he meant to ignore it. Sometimes neglect grows quietly. It settles into daily life until nobody questions it anymore. The only person who seemed to notice was Emily. A few days after the family dinner, she knocked softly on my basement door. I looked up from my book and saw her standing there with an uncertain expression. She stepped inside and sat across from me without speaking. Then she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Grandma, are you happy living here?" I looked at her for a long moment. Before I could answer, she lowered her eyes and twisted her hands together nervously. It was clear she already knew the answer. And for the first time, I began to wonder what else she knew. Emily's question stayed with me long after she returned upstairs. I sat alone in my small downstairs living room, staring at the half-finished chapter of my book without reading a single word. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind the trees, leaving faint shadows across the carpet. The house was quiet except for the occasional sound of footsteps above me. I kept hearing her voice. "Are you happy living here?" Children often notice things adults choose to ignore. They see patterns without becoming distracted by explanations. The next morning, I woke before 6 as usual. I made coffee, started a load of laundry, and began preparing breakfast. By 7 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and fresh biscuits. Jason came downstairs first, distracted by emails on his phone. He thanked me for breakfast without looking up. Amber followed a few minutes later. She barely acknowledged me before sitting at the island and scrolling through social media. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet after my conversation with Emily, I found myself paying closer attention. I noticed how Amber referred to the house as hers even when discussing things I paid for. I noticed how she volunteered my time to neighbors and relatives without asking. Most of all, I noticed how often she spoke about me as if I were not standing right there. Later that afternoon, I was folding towels in the laundry room when I heard voices drifting from the family room. The door had been left slightly open. I was not trying to listen, but Amber's voice carried easily through the hallway. "Honestly, I do not know what we would do without her," she said. At first, I thought she was complimenting me. Then she laughed. Hiring help would cost a fortune. Several people laughed with her. Another voice asked whether I ever complained. Amber answered immediately. "Never. She likes feeling needed." The conversation moved on, but I stood frozen beside the dryer. Hiring help would cost a fortune. That was how she saw me. Not as family. Not as Jason's mother. Not as Emily's grandmother. Simply as a convenient solution to household expenses. I finished folding the towels and carried them upstairs. Nobody seemed aware that I had heard a single word. That evening, Emily appeared downstairs again. This time she closed the door behind her. Her expression looked unusually serious. She sat on the couch and pulled her knees close to her chest. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Grandma, can I tell you something without you getting upset?" I smiled gently. "You can tell me anything." She hesitated. "Mom makes jokes about you when you are not around." The words were painful, but not surprising. Emily lowered her eyes. Sometimes when she posts videos online, she says things before she starts recording. Mean things. I remained silent. I tried telling Dad once, she continued. He said she was probably joking. I looked toward the basement window. The evening sky had turned deep blue. Somewhere outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across a neighboring yard. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt different now. Why are you telling me this? I asked softly. Emily looked up. Her eyes filled with disappointment far beyond her 16 years. Because nobody else will. Then she reached into the pocket of her sweatshirt and pulled out her phone. She held it tightly for a moment before placing it on the coffee table between us. There is something you need to see, she said. I found it yesterday after dinner. My heart began to beat a little faster. Emily turned the screen toward me. What appeared there would change the way I saw my place in that family forever. My hands remained still as I looked down at the phone resting on the coffee table. Emily sat quietly beside me, watching my face with nervous anticipation. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I picked up the phone and pressed play. The screen showed the dining room from earlier that week. The angle was different from the version I had overheard during dinner. This recording had started before anyone realized the camera was active. Amber's voice filled the room immediately. Make sure you get this part, she said. People love seeing her do all the work. Another voice laughed. I recognized one of Amber's friends. The camera shook slightly as someone adjusted it. In the background, I could see myself carrying serving dishes from the kitchen, completely unaware that I was being discussed. Then Amber spoke again. Honestly, having Margaret here saves us thousands every year. More laughter followed. My stomach tightened. Not because of the insult itself. By then I had already begun understanding how she viewed me. What hurt was hearing the certainty in her voice. There was no guilt, no hesitation, only amusement. The video continued. Someone asked whether I ever got tired of helping around the house. Amber shrugged and smiled toward the camera. She would not know what to do with herself otherwise. The room laughed again. I stared at the screen. For years I had convinced myself that every uncomfortable moment had an explanation. Every rude comment was stress. Every thoughtless action was an accident. Now those excuses felt fragile. One by one they were falling apart. Emily reached over and paused the video. There is more, she said quietly. I looked at her. How did you find this? She glanced toward the ceiling as if making sure nobody upstairs could hear us. Mom accidentally uploaded the wrong version to a private folder connected to the family account. I was looking for vacation pictures. I nodded slowly. Emily resumed the video. A few seconds later, Amber's friend asked a question that changed everything. So what happens if she decides to move out? Amber rolled her eyes dramatically. She will not. Where would she go? Another person pointed out that I had owned my own home before moving in. Amber laughed. That house is gone. Besides, she practically belongs here now. Belongs here. The phrase lingered in my mind long after the video ended. Not because it sounded welcoming. It sounded possessive, as though I were another household appliance. Useful. Convenient. Expected to remain exactly where I was. Emily lowered the phone. The room became quiet again. I noticed tears forming in her eyes. I am sorry, Grandma. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. None of this is your fault. She nodded but looked unconvinced. After she returned upstairs, I remained alone in the basement. The phone sat beside me while darkness slowly settled outside the window. I thought about Daniel. I thought about the life we built together. The sacrifices we made. The years spent saving money, paying bills, planning carefully for the future. Somewhere during those memories, another thought surfaced. A simple one. During all these years living here, I had never really examined the financial arrangements surrounding the house. I paid certain expenses because it seemed helpful. I contributed whenever something needed attention. Yet suddenly I found myself wondering exactly how much I was contributing. The next morning, while everyone else was occupied with their routines, I opened a drawer containing old records and receipts I had carefully saved. What began as curiosity quickly became concern. And before the week was over, that concern would lead me to discover something Amber never expected me to find. For the next several days, I said nothing. I followed the same routine I always had. I prepared breakfast, drove Emily to school, folded laundry, watered the flower beds. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But each evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the small desk in my downstairs living room and sorted through paperwork. Receipts. utility statements, insurance records, property tax notices, documents I had carefully saved for years. At first, I expected to find very little. Instead, I discovered a pattern. Every month, I contributed far more than I realized. I paid for groceries regularly. I covered several home maintenance expenses. I had even paid for a new water heater the previous year after Amber insisted the family budget was stretched too thin. The total surprised me. Over 3 years, the amount added up to tens of thousands of dollars. Yet nobody ever spoke about those contributions. The narrative was always the same. Margaret lived here because her family was helping her. Margaret was fortunate to have a place to stay. Margaret should be grateful. One afternoon, I visited the local bank where Daniel and I had done business for decades. The familiar brick building sat only a few miles from the house. Walking through the front doors felt strangely comforting. The manager, a woman named Karen whom I had known for years, greeted me warmly. We talked for a while before I asked her to help me review several accounts connected to my finances. As we examined the records, another uncomfortable realization emerged. Many automatic payments tied to household expenses originated directly from my accounts. I sat quietly while Karen printed reports. The steady hum of the printer filled the room. Page after page appeared. Numbers, dates, transfers, evidence. None of it suggested wrongdoing. Yet all of it told a story I had never fully seen before. I was not simply helping. In many ways, I was helping sustain the household. Driving home, I felt oddly calm. Not angry, not devastated, just clear. Sometimes the truth arrives gradually, like sunlight moving across a room. You do not notice the change until suddenly everything is illuminated. That evening, Amber hosted several friends on the back patio. Their laughter drifted through the open windows while I prepared dinner. At one point, I carried a tray of iced tea outside. Nobody offered to help. Nobody thanked me. The conversation continued as though I were invisible. As I turned to go back inside, one of Amber's friends smiled and said, "You are lucky to have her around." Amber laughed. "Trust me, we know." The group chuckled. I smiled politely and returned to the kitchen. A few years earlier, that comment would have hurt. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Later that night, Emily came downstairs again. She had become quieter lately, more observant. She sat across from me while I organized another stack of papers. "Grandma," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." She hesitated. "Do you know whose house this actually is?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Emily leaned forward. "Mom keeps talking about renovating the downstairs level after you leave someday. She says she already has plans for it." I looked at her steadily. "Did she say that recently?" Emily nodded. "Last week." Then she lowered her voice. "She acts like everything here already belongs to her." After Emily went upstairs, I sat awake long into the night. Her words echoed in my mind. Everything here already belongs to her. The following morning, I pulled out a folder I had not opened in years. Inside were legal documents Daniel and I had signed shortly before his retirement. Trust paperwork, property records, estate planning documents. I carried the folder to my desk and slowly began reading. By the time I reached the final pages, I realized something extraordinary. Amber had built her confidence on an assumption, and that assumption was completely wrong. The folder remained open on my desk long after midnight. I read every page twice, then a third time. The language was formal, filled with legal terms Daniel and I had reviewed years earlier with our attorney. At the time, it felt like one more retirement task, something responsible adults did when planning for the future. I never imagined those documents would become so important. The property was held inside a family trust. Daniel and I had established it together. After his passing, I became the sole trustee. The house itself remained under trust ownership. It had never been transferred to Jason. It certainly had never belonged to Amber. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. For months, perhaps years, Amber had spoken as though every room in that house already belonged to her. She discussed renovations, future plans, design ideas. She talked about expanding the downstairs living area once it became available. Yet according to the documents in front of me, none of those decisions were hers to make. The realization did not make me feel victorious. It made me feel sad. Somewhere along the way, assumptions had replaced respect. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with the attorney who had helped Daniel and me create the trust. His office occupied the second floor of a small brick building downtown. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room overlooking Main Street. A few minutes later, Richard Bennett entered carrying a file folder. He looked older than I remembered, but his smile was unchanged. We spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents. When we finished, his conclusion matched my understanding exactly. Nothing had changed. The trust remained active. I retained complete authority over the property. Any future transfer would require my direct approval. As I prepared to leave, Richard paused. "Margaret, may I ask something?" I nodded. "Of course." He folded his hands carefully. "Has someone led you to believe otherwise?" I thought about Amber's comments. The videos. The conversations. The plan she discussed so confidently. For a moment, I considered explaining everything. Instead, I simply smiled. I wanted to make sure I understood the facts. Richard studied me for a second before nodding. Facts have a way of becoming important at the right moment. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. Trees lined the streets. American flags fluttered from several front porches. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Ordinary scenes. Yet for the first time in weeks, I felt grounded. I was no longer relying on assumptions. I knew exactly where I stood. That evening, Amber hosted another gathering on the patio. Several neighbors joined them for drinks and conversation. Through the kitchen window, I could hear laughter floating across the yard. As I prepared a tray of appetizers, snippets of conversation drifted inside. Then I heard Amber's voice. "We are already thinking about what to do with the lower level in the future." One of the neighbors asked whether she planned to build a home office. Amber laughed. "Maybe. There is a lot of space down there." I placed the final plate onto the tray and carried everything outside. Nobody realized I had heard a word. Nobody noticed the calm expression on my face. Later that night, after the guests had gone home, Emily knocked softly on my door once again. She stepped inside and sat beside me. "You look different," she said. I smiled. "Different how?" She thought for a moment. "Less worried." I considered her answer carefully. Then I reached over and squeezed her hand. Sometimes understanding the truth makes things easier. Emily nodded slowly. Before leaving, she hesitated near the doorway. "Mom is planning a big family dinner next Saturday." I looked up. "A special occasion?" "Not really," Emily said. "She just wants everyone together." After she left, I sat quietly for several minutes. A family dinner. Relatives. Friends. Plenty of witnesses. For the first time, I found myself thinking that perhaps the right moment Richard mentioned was approaching much sooner than anyone expected. The week passed quietly, at least on the surface. I continued my routines exactly as before. Every morning, I prepared breakfast. Every afternoon, I picked up Emily from school. Every evening, I helped with dinner. Nothing about my behavior changed, and that was intentional. People reveal the most when they believe nothing is wrong. Amber certainly believed everything was proceeding according to plan. As Saturday approached, her excitement became impossible to miss. She spent days preparing for the family gathering. New decorations appeared throughout the house. Extra chairs arrived from a rental company. She even ordered custom floral arrangements for the dining room table. Watching her move confidently through the house was strangely fascinating. She spoke about future renovations as though they were already approved. She discussed design ideas with friends. She talked about converting the downstairs level into something entirely different someday. Each conversation rested upon that same assumption. She believed the future belonged to her. On Thursday afternoon, I was organizing kitchen cabinets when I overheard another conversation. Amber was speaking on the phone near the family room. "The lower level alone could become an amazing content studio," she said. A pause followed. Then she laughed. "Trust me. Eventually the space will open up." I closed the cabinet door gently and continued working. No anger, no confrontation, just observation. That evening, I received a phone call from Richard Bennett. He wanted to confirm a few details regarding the trust documents. During our conversation, he mentioned something Daniel had insisted upon years earlier. A specific letter had been placed with the estate records. Richard described it as a personal statement rather than a legal document. Curious, I asked whether I could review it. The following morning, I visited his office again. He handed me a sealed envelope with Daniel's handwriting across the front. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter was dated nearly 10 years earlier. Daniel wrote about family, responsibility, gratitude. He explained why we had structured our estate carefully. Then I reached a paragraph that stopped me cold. If there ever comes a day when someone mistakes generosity for entitlement, remember this house was built to protect our family, not reward disrespect. I read those words 3 times. It felt as though Daniel were sitting beside me once again. Calm, practical, wise. He had always noticed things long before others did. Driving home, I carried the letter carefully in my purse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. For the first time since discovering the videos, I felt something unexpected. Confidence. Not because I planned revenge. Not because I wanted anyone humiliated. I simply knew the truth now. Truth has a quiet strength. It does not need to shout. Saturday finally arrived. By late afternoon, relatives began arriving one after another. Jason's cousins, a few close family friends, several neighbors. The house filled with conversation and laughter. Amber moved through the crowd like a hostess preparing for a celebration. She smiled constantly. She posed for photographs. She filmed short videos throughout the evening. More than once, I caught her pointing the camera in my direction. As always, I remained polite, helpful, invisible. During dinner, I noticed something else. Emily looked unusually attentive. She watched every interaction carefully. Occasionally, our eyes met across the table. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. We both understood that something important was approaching. As dessert was served, Amber stood and tapped her glass lightly. The room gradually fell silent. She smiled toward the guests. Before everyone leaves, I have a few exciting things I want to share about our future plans. Around the table, people leaned forward with interest. Amber looked delighted. Jason smiled proudly beside her. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I already knew exactly how the evening was about to change. Amber smiled confidently as she stood beside the dining room table. The candles flickered softly. Guests settled back into their chairs, waiting to hear whatever announcement she had prepared. Many of you know how much we love this house, she began. We have been talking about some exciting plans for the future. Several people nodded. Jason smiled beside her. Amber continued describing renovations, upgrades, and ideas she hoped to implement someday. She spoke with remarkable certainty. Listening to her felt almost surreal. Every sentence assumed ownership. Every plan assumed authority. Around the table, relatives listened politely. A few even asked questions about timelines and design ideas. Amber answered each one enthusiastically. Then she mentioned the downstairs level. That space has so much potential, she said. Eventually, we are going to transform it completely. I noticed Emily lower her gaze. Across the table, one of Jason's cousins asked whether the renovations would begin soon. Amber laughed. Sooner than people think. Several guests chuckled. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. Then I stood. The movement was small, but it immediately drew attention. Amber paused mid-sentence. The room grew quiet. Actually, I said gently, before we discuss future plans, there is something I would like to share. Amber looked surprised. Jason blinked and turned toward me. I rarely interrupted family gatherings. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Amber forced a smile. Of course, Margaret. I reached into my purse and removed a folder. The same folder I had reviewed countless times during the previous week. The room watched curiously as I placed it on the table. Many years ago, Daniel and I worked very hard to plan for our family's future. I began. We wanted stability, security, clarity. Several relatives nodded respectfully at the mention of my late husband. I opened the folder and removed a few documents. Recently, I realized there has been some confusion regarding this property. Amber's smile faded slightly. Jason looked puzzled. Confusion? He asked. Yes, I replied calmly. Specifically concerning ownership and decision-making authority. The room became noticeably quieter. Even the casual conversations near the far end of the table stopped. I handed a copy of one document to Jason, then another to a nearby relative who happened to be an accountant. Both men began reading. Amber crossed her arms. What exactly is this about? She asked. I met her eyes. The house is held in a family trust. It has never been transferred. It remains under my authority as trustee. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Just genuine surprise. Jason looked down at the document again, then back at me. Wait, he said slowly. You mean? I mean the property decisions are not yours to make, I said gently. Nor anyone else's. Amber stared at me. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed completely unprepared. I continued speaking calmly. There was no anger in my voice. No accusation. Only facts. I explained the trust structure, the estate planning, the legal confirmations I had recently reviewed. Then I shared something else. The financial records, utility payments, maintenance expenses, contributions that I had quietly made over the years. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Jason's expression changed completely. "Mom," he said softly. I had no idea. I believed him. That was the difference. Jason had been inattentive. Amber had been entitled. One was painful. The other was deliberate. Then I removed one final item from the folder. Daniel's letter. I read a short passage aloud. The room listened in complete silence. When I finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. Amber looked down at the table. Jason stared at the documents in front of him. Across the room, Emily watched quietly. And for the first time in years, I no longer felt invisible. The gathering ended much earlier than Amber had planned. Guests lingered for a while, speaking quietly among themselves before gradually heading home. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The truth had done all the work. After the front door closed behind the last visitor, the house became unusually still. Jason remained seated at the dining table, staring at the documents spread out before him. The confidence he had carried earlier in the evening was gone. He looked tired, older somehow. Amber disappeared upstairs without saying much. For once, she had no speech prepared. No explanation. No audience. I gathered empty dessert plates and carried them into the kitchen. Habit is a powerful thing. Even after everything, I found myself cleaning up. A few moments later, Jason appeared beside me. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned toward him. He looked down before meeting my eyes. I should have paid attention. There was no excuse in his voice. No attempt to shift responsibility. Just regret. I nodded slowly. "You should have." He swallowed hard. "I did not realize how much you were doing. Or how much you were contributing." I thought about all the years that had passed. The meals. The errands. The endless small tasks. Most of all, I thought about how easily people stop noticing sacrifices when they become routine. "That is the problem with being useful," I said softly. "Eventually people forget you are making a choice." Jason lowered his head. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he surprised me. "I am sorry." 3 simple words. Words I had needed to hear for a very long time. The following week brought changes. Not dramatic changes. Real ones. Conversations happened. Behind closed doors. Financial responsibilities were reviewed. Household expectations were discussed openly for the first time in years. I stayed out of most of it. My goal had never been control. My goal had been clarity. One afternoon, Amber knocked on my downstairs door. When I opened it, she stood there looking uncomfortable. Gone was the confident smile she usually carried. She seemed unsure of what to say. "Can we talk?" she asked. I invited her inside. She sat across from me and stared at her hands for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. I never thought about how some of those comments sounded. I listened quietly. She admitted she had become careless. That social media attention had encouraged behavior she should have questioned. That somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as part of the background. Her apology was imperfect. Human apologies usually are. But it was honest enough for me. I accepted it without bitterness. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means deciding not to carry the weight forever. A month later, Amber and Jason made a decision. They purchased a smaller home across town and began preparing for the move. It was the right choice. Their marriage needed space to grow independently. I needed my own life again. Emily visited almost every weekend during the transition. One Saturday afternoon, she helped me plant flowers in the backyard. As we worked, she smiled and asked whether I was happy now. I looked around. The garden Daniel and I had planted years ago was blooming beautifully. The house felt peaceful, quiet. Mine. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." Several months after the move, I hosted a family dinner. The same dining room. The same table. The same porcelain plates that had belonged to my mother. But the atmosphere felt completely different. Nobody treated me like an obligation. Nobody treated me like a convenience. I sat at the head of the table while conversation and laughter filled the room. At one point, I glanced toward the empty chair beside me and thought of Daniel. I imagined him smiling. Not because I had won some battle, but because I had finally remembered something important. Respect is not something you beg for. It is something you protect. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is quietly stand up tell the truth, and refuse to become invisible ever again.